and gentlemen, thank you very much for a very warm welcome in cold sport. The warmth of the welcome and the friendship that my wife and I have experienced since our arrival makes up for the cold and the wet. It's quite an extraordinary day. I mean, it's not every year that we have the 29th of February. And it's not often that a day is dedicated to me. Thank you for the honor bestowed upon me. It's also not a regular event that I am in a distant part of the United States, if you regard, let's say, Washington as more or less the center, welcomed in Afrikaans by a reverend coming from South Africa, serving in this beautiful church. And also it's special because I haven't spoken in the church for a long time, although I'm a regular church goer. Thank you for a warm welcome. Ladies and gentlemen, I will be addressing you on the title of my speech is Decisions that Build Peace in an Unpredictable World. History is full of pivotal moments when a decision, one way or the other, has sent events in a dramatically different direction. How would Europe have developed during the 19th century had Napoleon not decided to invade Russia? What would have happened if the victorious Allies had not imposed such a crippling peace treaty on the Germans at Versailles after the First World War? How would the world look today if a hardliner, instead of Mikhail Gorbachev, had succeeded to the leadership of the Soviet Union in the early 80s? This is interesting speculation, but it is all water under the historical bridge. The challenge is to identify the pivotal issues, the issues that confront us today, and to ensure that we now take the right decisions to build a peaceful and a sustainable future. 25 years ago, we South Africa were confronted with the need to make critical and pivotal decisions. By the beginning of the 80s, it was becoming increasingly clear to many of us in the leadership positions in the South Africa's ruling National Party that we were on the wrong course. We were becoming more and more isolated from the international community with each year that passed. The great majority of black South Africans were increasingly adamant in their rejection of our policies. As a result, we have become trapped in a downward spiral of resistance and repression that threatened at some stage in the not too distant future to erupt into full-scale conflict. We were looking a form of catastrophe in the eyes. All of this was having an increasingly damaging effect on our economy and was threatening to shut down the engine of economic growth that was and remains our best hope of bringing all our people a better life. My colleagues in the National Party and I spent a great deal of time identifying our problems and wrestling with the need for fundamental change. In open and often brutally frank discussions, we examined the hard and unpalatable facts that confronted us. We also struggled with the question of what was right and what was wrong within the framework of our values. What I supported when I was a young man was not the suppression of black people, was full rights and justice the right solution for Israel and Palestine, to bring full political rights to all through the concept of nation state. But we failed for many reasons. Those reasons is subject matter for a speech on its own. We failed to bring justice. And at the end of the 70s and in the early 80s, not only I, but also my fellow leaders in the National Party realized that through our own actions and history has landed that we've landed in a place which was morally unjustified. That we have to change. And this led to, at the end of the 80s, when I became president, to a situation where we decided to take initiatives which would ensure justice for all in South Africa, to take initiatives which would ensure full political rights for everyone, but also to take initiatives which would lead to a stable new South Africa. We could have come to power for 2 or more decades, but we also knew that with every passing year, our situation would become more desperate and our options more limited. We did have genuine concerns about embarking on a process that would lead inevitably to our losing power. We struggled with the question, what would become of the right of my people, the Afrikaners, to the national self-determination that had been the central theme of our history for almost 200 years, that led us to fight a debilitating 3-year war against Great Britain when they annexed the 2 Afrikaner republics. We struggled with the question, how could we be sure that change in South Africa would not lead to the chaos and the tyranny that had unhappily accompanied the independence of so many African countries to the north of us. Neither could we ignore the strategic threat posed by the Soviet Union and the influence of the South African Communist Party in the African National Congress, shortly referred to as the ANC. We knew that nearly all the members of the ANC's National Executive Committee were also members of the South African Communist Party. We knew that South African Communist Party cadres controlled key functions within the ANC alliance, most notably its armed wing, Umkhonto Wesizwe. We knew that the SACP proposed a 2-phase revolution, a national liberation phase that would include all forces opposed to apartheid, during which the ANC would be the vanguard party, but then a second democratic liberation phase that would culminate under the leadership of the South African Communist Party in the achievement of what they call the democratic revolution and the establishment of the people's democracy. They wanted a communist state, and it was firmly their goal to achieve it by using also the ANC. This was, after all, the classic formula that had been successfully followed in the Cuban and Vietnamese revolutions. Former South African governments did not feel that they were under any moral obligation to accept a one-man, one-vote process that would quickly lead to the demise of democracy and the establishment of a totalitarian communist regime, as had already happened in a number of neighboring states. And let me assure you, ladies and gentlemen, when I emphasize the communist threat, it's not a question of reds under beds. The communist threat was very real. The contest between the free world and the Soviet bloc was taking place through third world liberation struggles. One of the main battlegrounds was Southern Africa, where South South African forces had until as late as the end of 1987 been involved in large-scale battles with Cuban and Soviet-led forces in Angola. We knew that we had to take decisions that would affect the future of our country, our people, and our families for generations to come. We knew that we have reached the stage to make pivotal decisions. But we also knew that we would have to take those decisions in the context of a rapidly changing environment. By the end of 1989, the situation in the world and in South Africa had changed and had begun to create circumstances that were conducive for transformation. By 1987, all the significant parties involved in the South African conflict had come to accept that there could be neither a military nor a revolutionary victory. They also knew that continuing conflict would simply turn South Africa into a wasteland. Economic growth from the 60s onwards have brought about significant economic and social changes. Between 1970 and 1994, the black share of disposable income increased from 28.9% to almost 50%. Millions of black South Africans moved to the cities and improved their standard of living and education. By 1989, when I became president, they had begun to occupy key positions in the industrial and commercial sectors. Increasingly, they were becoming indispensable in the white-collar professions. By 1994, there were more black South Africans at university than white. Similar changes were taking place in the white Afrikaner community, in the hearts and minds of my people. In the decades following 1960, a whole generation of young Afrikaners moved from the working class to the middle class. They graduated from university and traveled abroad and were inevitably influenced by global values. They no longer shared the fiery nationalism of their parents and grandparents, and by the early 80s, they were becoming increasingly uncomfortable with apartheid. By 1989, they were ripe for change. Another factor which was helpful was the tripartite agreement between South Africa, Cuba, and Angola reached in 1988. It led to the withdrawal of Cuban forces from Angola, the implementation of United Nations Resolution 435, and the independence of Namibia. The negotiations and successful implementation of the United Nations Independence Plan during 1989 reassured the South African government that it could secure its core interests through negotiations with its opponents. And then the final and critically important factor was the collapse of global communism at the end of the 1980s, the coming down of the Berlin Wall. At the start, it removed the government's primary strategic concern, the demise of international communism and the manifest success of free market economies also meant that there was no longer any serious debate with regard to the economic policies that would be required to ensure economic growth in a future democratic